Hi there, I'm Sai. Welcome to my channel called Nugget of Wisdom, and I'm here in my motorhome called Joy. It's a bit stormy, windy and wet outside, but nice and warm and snuggly in here. Um, you'll see from all my videos, I've been trying to kind of lay this foundation that looks at very critical things that help us form an opinion about stories we hear, videos we watch on the internet. And the reason for doing that is because these stories that we hear influence how we live our lives. And we can live our lives in a very peaceful and happy way, or we can live our lives in a very stressful way. And a lot of these stories I've explained to you before, a lot of the things we hear and see, there are all sorts of motives behind the reasons that we hear them, the reasons why they have these perspectives. And so I wanted to talk about free will because basically, if you go on the net and you look at all of the most interesting philosophers, they will basically tell you that there's no such thing as free will. So what they're really saying is that everything is determined, that every decision you make is predetermined. Now, we live in a world where free will is a very fundamental part of almost every belief we have. Our justice system, morals, the rights and wrongs of things, rewards, our status in society, who gets more resource, who doesn't. The salaries we get in our jobs. I mean, it goes on and on. And that's because there's this idea that we can influence we can influence the decisions that are made in our lives, and if we do a good job of those, we get rewarded. If we do a bad job or we break laws, we get thrown in prison. So if you take free will away and you listen to what the scientists say, and they're adamant in the main, especially intellectual scientists, that they can prove there's no free will, then you get to a rabbit hole where people will say, well, if there's no free will, then people can do whatever they want. The whole of society collapses. Also, you'll find that there's a lot of talk about the ego and the ego self, and how that often is enmeshed in childhood programming, which drives everything that we do. So that the free will we think we have is actually a lot of decision making based on a lot of programming that occurred when we were young. And you could also say that I, here and now, am a product of millions and millions of major and small decisions that were made to get me to this place where I am today. And that there's no free will in any of that. So my view is that I think, first of all, language is very dualistic and a blunt instrument. And when people talk about free will, often I just wonder what they mean by free will. If you look at the Oxford Dictionary, it says, the power of acting without the constraint of necessity or fate, the ability to act at one's own discretion. Well, it's a very unusual, what does that mean? We can do whatever we want. We're totally at liberty to do whatever we want. Well, first of all, there are millions and millions of processes going on in my body at the moment that are keeping me alive, that I've got zero control over. If I want to, I can interrupt my breathing, but in reality, most of the time, it's just happening by itself. And if I tried to take control of that, and control of my heartbeat and my liver function and everything else, my little mind here would never be able to cope with it, and I'd be dead very quickly. So I don't think that most people really, if they had the choice, would want to have complete free will over anything. The other thing is, supposing they did, supposing we ended up with control of everything and we had a utopian world and everything was peaceful and loving, it would be just our version of what was peaceful and loving. Because somebody else would have a completely different opinion. There are people in the world today, lots of them, who believe what they're doing is good and the other side is evil. And if you brought them all in a room and tried to get them to argue and do investigations and analysis and get the best experts in, they'd never agree. So the whole notion of free will for me is complicated and difficult. I think the intellectual mind is obsessed with control. And what it wants to do is say, oh, I want to control the world, but I can't, because now it's proven that there is no free will. So the whole of society crumbles. But if you look at all the other creatures in the world, in the main, they have no idea what free will is. They have no idea what morals are. They have no idea, they have no religions. They haven't the kind of self-awareness that we have. They're not all murdering and killing each other. In the main, they're not. They have their systems that they live within, and their food chain, where they are in the food chain, and the things they have to do to survive. But you're not seeing these crazy sort of situations where large swathes of creatures are just going out and murdering and killing each other for really no resource reason. It's not like that, we in the world today, in the main, are fighting each other for food. We're not doing that. So the animal kingdom doesn't know anything about free will, and it's still fine, pretty much. If you look at the bonobos, for example, they're, I think, 98% genetic code of the human species. They're a pretty peaceful bunch. Ask them about free will and morals and everything else, and they'll just look at you and probably try to look for some fleas in your hair, scratch your back. They won't really care about any of this stuff. They won't even understand it, to be honest. But also, I think, understanding that my understanding of free will is very limited, I think that becoming more self-aware of what you're not, understanding that you are the product of all these influences, understanding that you are the product, your persona and your ego, the programming in you, is the result of lots of experiences in your childhood, especially throughout the generations, biological, physical, emotional, mental, all sorts. Understanding this and being able to become more self-aware, that's sort of breathing in and breathing out, being in the world, breathing out and being creative and being active, breathing in, being present, living in the now. That, I think, gives us more opportunity to, I wouldn't say be in control, but be in the flow. Just like sort of my analogy with respect to the river, similar to what the Taoist philosophy, the Tao Te Ching, great book. You have a river, and you're trying to row up the river, go against the river. Where really what you want to be doing is just going with the flow. Being in tune with your natural self, understanding all these drives that are within you to push you against the flow, and having paddles. So you have paddles that allow you to navigate, and collectively we unfold and we grow, and creative things happen. They may be all predetermined, or they may not be predetermined. They just are. I also think that the nature of the world clearly is to expand in the most beautiful and creative ways. And so I don't think, a sort of a very mechanical approach to free will, to say it's all predetermined and everything is just unfolding like clockwork. I don't think that fits either. It doesn't feel like it fits, because we live in a world with such variety and beauty and creativity and unfolding. So the second thing I wanted to discuss is the shadow self, as defined by Carl Jung, a very famous philosopher, psychologist. I think he was both, really. But Carl Jung described the shadow as the dark side. So people talk about good and evil. And again, If you want to go off and look for the definition of good and evil, it's difficult. In many instances in the past, evil was very much pinpointed, sort of mindless, this mindless person doing really dastardly and terrible things. And then the punishment was usually to be killed or, hung or guillotined or burnt at the stake. But when you look at the crimes in those days, often what was deemed as evil is very different to what we have today. And people had mental health illnesses. People had published books about different perspectives on the world and different perspectives on religion. They were deemed heretics. They were deemed blasphemers. They were deemed evil. And they were killed for it. So our understanding of evil has changed quite a bit. Good? Well, one man's good is another man's evil. And, just look around the world in 2023 and just get a snapshot of what one group thinks is good and another group thinks is evil, and how they're willing to kill each other en masse over it. So, the shadow, I have a shadow. We all have a shadow. The shadow, I would say, rather than saying good or evil, I would say light and darkness. My view is, fundamentally, we're all light. At the core, we're all love. Love is being. Love is oneness. But the darkness is the shadow. The darkness is a kind of often it's a force that's there that is necessary for us to awaken to our higher selves, for our consciousness to grow. Because if you don't have these dualities, you can't experience. If you never experience cold, then you'll never really understand what it's really like to be warm. You have to experience cold to experience the warmth. And the world is full of duality. So often these shadows and these dark forces in our world, they have a boundary. And when we get pushed to that boundary, and it creates suffering, and it creates, tragedy, and it creates pain and loss, what it does is it's like cracking a nut open. It forces us to grow and to awaken. And one of those awakenings, which is really important, is to realize that these dark forces are in all of us. Which, in a very moralistic world where people don't really evaluate or assess or look at the nature of truth and everything else, and are extremely tribal, and have egos which are so enmeshed in the idea that they are the good, to admit that there's dark forces within us is very difficult. For most people, it's very difficult. But we all know that there's dark forces within us. We all know it. And what you'll find is often, as soon as anybody starts to uncover the dark force in somebody else, there's a hugely crazy reaction. Reaction is either anger, frustration, physical violence, or mass killing of people. But a fantastic opportunity to awaken is for us all to realize that we're a mix of sort of the good and bad, the light and the darkness. And by actually understanding that, and being able to look at ourselves and observe and say, I see this, you become more self-aware. When you have a desire to do something that you know fundamentally at your core is not right, you can stop. You can start to have empathy and respect for others who do things that are deemed bad. And you can start to look at others with compassion and realize we're all one. And then, of course, comes the question, okay, then that sounds all lovey-dovey. So we just live in a world where everybody is love, we all love everybody else, and there's no bad and no good, and it's no evil, that's a recipe for disaster. Well, it's not a recipe for disaster, because the animal kingdom survives pretty well without any of these notions. We innately within ourselves give ourselves some respect here. Human beings, we have really, really strong inward processes, tools that fundamentally guide us. We know wrong from right. And there's some basics with our sensory environment. We know that if you do something that's not good, that is dangerous, that is hurtful for somebody else, you suffer. You lose. But also, more importantly, we can have rules and regulations and laws and consequences for acts in the world. But we don't have to hate the people or tag them as evil once we enact those rules and laws. Some we deem to be taking control of a population, changing the society so that it's now people they lost their freedoms, they're being discriminated against, there's racism, there's homophobia, there's all sorts of stuff going on. If we feel as a society that leader is acting not in the interests of us, but in the interests of himself or his ego, we don't have to demonize him. We can love him, totally love him. But we can take him out of the position that he's in. Take him away from having influence and power. And if he exhibits serious mental health issues, and it's impossible for him to live in the world and navigate the world, then he's put in an institution where he's treated humanely and with respect. But he's constrained because we know that for the greater good point of view, his way of being in the world is influencing others in a very detrimental way. We can still love him. We don't have to hate him. We don't have to create moral stories about good and evil. We don't have to demonize him. None of it. And so I really think that part of our growth in society is non-judgment. It's getting to a point where we can collectively make decisions that are for the good of humanity, with respect, without judgment, with humanity, with empathy. And we're not there in the world at the moment. We're still stuck in this tribal, very sort of, I would call, dinosaur world approach to everything. And the arguments are always, oh, but you just want to let everybody do what the hell they like. No. Absolutely not. In fact, the people I love and respect most of all are those who take actions to protect others. Those people who have put their lives at risk to save others from harm. And afterwards, when they were asked, do you want a medal for this? We're going to give you this because you're a hero. Thank you. They didn't want to know. They just said, it's just something I had to do. It was just part of me. And they may have had to do things that they didn't want to do in order to save others. But they were able to look upon everybody in that cycle of events with respect and empathy and love and non-judgment. And so when I discuss topics that are of interest to me in the world, and I start to offer my perspective, I really want that knowing to be part of it. That I'm not judging. I'm assessing how truthful something is, what the scoring is. I'm not moralizing. I'm not demonizing. But also, I'm conscious that there has to be some sort of process or system in place to deal with those who basically, because of their activities, are causing harm to others. It's pretty straightforward, pretty sensible approach to things. But what it does is it takes away all these narratives and stories that we're bombarded with every day that stop us from actually saying, hold on a second, what's really going on here? What's really going on? How can we work out what's really going on here and find some way to fix it, to make it better, to improve it, to prevent the loss of life, to make life more peaceful, to make the world a healthier place, to make the world a more prosperous, caring and loving place. We can get rid of all this nonsense that is all over our society, a madness, and clearly is leading to all sorts of negative outcomes for us. So thank you for listening and watching this video, and I look forward to seeing you again in the future.